performing, I'll just tell her that she needs to stand. I'll ask her to stand here. Great.
So you're not going to want to go any further than say here, otherwise it's going to start
Yeah,
to.
I think National. Can I just see you over here?
The last half hour was clear Q&A. I just got Mac to agree. The people asking the questions are going to come up and
This
ask
one.
them.
Okay.
Or I will repeat them back into the microphone if I stand up here.
That's fine.
So Najma, this is your mic for the opening, and you can actually explain it probably better than I can. You have to basically stand right here.
Okay, up on the stage? That's how, okay.
Okay, so.
No.
Well, she can just
Just
be.
me and Naima.
We can set it up so that it's just the two of you back here. Or otherwise, why do you? It doesn't have to be back here.
Okay.
So you want? We can use these two, right?
Yeah, that's fine.
She can sit there.
I mean, she wants to stand.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
This is
You
the
know, it's
opening.
like, I don't mind it being like this and maybe if I just move this back and kind of like,
Well, here's how much space you have. So if you want to move, we have to adjust this.
I don't think you need. Look, I think Najma,
Should be right.
you come right here. You perform right here. We can move this chair out of your way so you have some space to move.
We can put
And then you can
With
sit
this
right
mic.
here and you just put
this
that
one
mic.
won't be on or what?
all these are on. Just easier for us to keep them here.
Okay, right on. So you gonna be on the other side?
She can sit right there. It makes the most
We
sense.
can move the chairs out of the way if you want to. You can,
Okay, so if this chair is gone, then I'm good with that. And
Yeah.
can I play a track underneath?
I don't know if it's going to be heard. That's the problem. So let's see what you have. Did you bring anything that?
Yes, I do. This little gadget right here. And I definitely done it here before. I think it's possible. Because
I was gonna bring it.
check, 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 check. Mic check 1 2. Mic check 1 2. Free the land, free political prisoners, free the land, we maroons. Mic check 1 2. That's a nice. Okay. Okay, oh wow. Okay.
probably do that. I'll give you a little intro. Yeah, I'll give you a little. Check, mic check. We're getting excited. We're getting ready for the event starting pretty soon here. We're grateful to our panelists who arrived and are ready. They're getting some sustenance right now so that they have enough energy to give you the truth. Because the truth takes energy. I don't know if y'all know that. I'm dropping some knowledge on you. I'm going to go ahead and say this on the mic, just so that everyone knows. It's not because the program is officially starting, but we have two prompts here. One says, I believe in a world that looks like, and that goes with these cool green cards. We just ask you to write down your ideas about that. Be as poetic as you feel like you want to be. And then we have a prompt that says, I remember fighting for. That goes with the orange. And again, Sowell is already imagining what he is going to write because the babies know where it's at. So I'll come around, give everybody one of each card, and I'll leave these up here. Yes, Leslie. You get to feel free. If you are moved with just one word, go for it. If you are moved by a visual image, you can put that down. If you're moved by a paragraph or a poem, you feel free to respond in whatever way your spirit is called. Great question. Like all good questions.
Oh, excellent. Oh, I like You would have to give me the whole piece. Like,
Good evening. That was the right answer. It just wasn't enough energy. So let's try it again. Good evening. Good evening. That's what's up. That's what's up. We are small, but we are mighty. I'm actually reading a really cool book right now called Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Marie Brown that actually talks about how powerful we can be in smaller numbers when we go deep. So my name is Signe Haraday. I'm with a New Black Arts Movement and Million Artists Movement. And when you arrived, you may have been instructed for a part of tonight. We are asking you to write on this orange card your answer to the prompt, I remember fighting for. I'm going to ask you to write that while I'm talking and while we have some artists kicking off the evening before our panelists come up. You also may have been invited to write on a green card. And this green card, the prompt is, I believe in a world that looks like. And you get to fill that in. And we are going to take your responses and before your eyes make a little magical, poetic theater moment for you. So, without any further ado, I'm going to invite two incredible artists up to the stage, Sister Najma and Sister Naima. You can show some love, it's okay. And because movement work starts with the word what? It's the first part? Move, right. So move, we find that music helps to move us. And so we are going to start tonight's conversation out with some music such that we will be ready to move. Without any further ado, take us away.
Check, check. Peace, 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 everyone. I think I'll come up here. This is Riot. This is Riot. It's a little something about a new black arts movement that, yes. Blue face, white lips, red blood, it's America. I rock the mic, hysteria, infiltrate in all areas. A movement founded by freedom fighters to break the barriers. Win our independence from oppressors and their carriers. I said win our independence from oppressors and their carriers. What? Win our independence. Free political prisoners, free the land, we maroons. Prefiguring a new society, it's a matriarchal tune. Value characteristics of indigeneity, rebelling against everything that they do to keep enslaving me. Freedom of mind, body, and spirit, you will hear it. Emancipating ourselves from the plantation, make them feel it. We remember and live with a purpose, that's how we heal it. Everything we ever were and created, they try to steal it. We live in harmony with Mother Earth, hold the center. In accordance with the laws of nurture, nature, we respect her. 7 generations before us, 7 generations ahead. Striving to never forget the names of the dead. Re-socializing men as mothers without limitations, self-determining our destiny, our path to liberation, seeing through illusions of equality and integration. Anti-authoritarians don't need your validation, yeah. In case you didn't hear that, anti-authoritarians don't need your validation. What? Yeah, yeah, yeah. Blue face, white lips, red blood, it's America. I rock the mic, hysteria, infiltrate in all areas. A movement founded by freedom fighters to break the barriers. Win our independence from oppressors and their carriers. Yeah, I said win our independence from oppressors and their carriers. What? Win our independence. Yeah, this soul material for your ears. Shed so many tears. Much respect to all the pioneers who put aside their fears. Yeah, come connect and build with us. We over here painting a new aesthetic, one we hold sacredly and dear. Amiri, Baraka, Nikki, Giovanni, Fred Ho, Sonia Sanchez, Maya Angelou. Let the spirit show. We more into exchange than dinero. When it comes to revolution, we putting it primero. A new black arts movement about ontological improvement. If you don't know what that is, I suggest you look into it. Commitment, capability, creativity, clarity, and compassion. Patience and resilience. We put it into action. Warriors, protectors, and fighters, oh my. Never said we were saints, never told you that lie. We in a social matrix full of hatred, so we stay sharp. Big up real education, due diligence, knock it out the park. Yeah, yeah. Big up real education, due diligence, knock it out the park. What? Knock it out the park. Knock, 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 knock. Blue face, white lips, red blood, it's America. I rock the mic, hysteria, infiltrate in all areas. A movement founded by freedom fighters to break the barriers. Win our independence from oppressors and their carriers, yeah. One more time now. I said win our independence from oppressors and their carriers. What? Yeah. Everything in society prior to Europeans was better. There was no prison industrial complex. There was no debtor, no capital punishment or weapons of mass destruction. They initiated abductions. We children of the Reconstruction. This is a call to arms. Ring the alarms. They confiscating natural seeds, demolishing our farms. Then they tell us they never meant to do us any harm. We so much smarter. X marks that revolutionary charm. There should be no bureaucrats, litigators, or administrators. We originators, soul squad stimulators, outlaws with responsibility, set in position where all equals politics produce our own provision. There's a protocol to our goals and strategies. Support a majority oppressed nationalities. Dismantling America's existing anatomy. Procedures on primary exercise principalities. Yeah. Procedures on primary exercise principalities. What? Alright, now one more time, y'all. Yeah. Yo, blue face, white lips, red blood, it's America. I rock the mic, hysteria, infiltrate in all areas. A movement founded by freedom fighters to break the barriers. Win our independence from oppressors and their carriers. Thank you so much. My name is Nejma Shea, Naima on guitar, New Black Arts Movement. Thank you so much.
So while that track is still flowing, thank you. I love you. These artists will actually be back later to bring your words to life on stage. That's what we're about to do. Matt's gonna bring our panelists up to the stage, and while he does that, I'm gonna come collect your cards.
So can we have also a round of applause for Signe Haraday, Million Artist Movement? You know, Signe's a poet, but we don't get to hear her poetry too much because she's always busy organizing, which is a form of poetry, at least the way she does it. Hell no, we still ain't going. Hell no. We decided, mainly Bob Brown and myself, some months ago, that in this moment of many 50th anniversaries, we'd pull together an evening that had two organizations that don't often always co-sponsor things together, the A.J. Musty Memorial Institute and the All African People's Revolutionary Party, GC, to bring together this evening of coalition building, of visioning, of reflecting on the past to build for stronger futures. So I'm really pleased to bring up some panelists that will be talking throughout the evening, interwoven with some of the poetry, arts, and dance that we'll be sharing later. And also mention that one panelist is not here yet, but you'll see her sneak on the stage later in the evening. That's Joanna Fernandez, who's a member of the A.J. Musty Institute Board, but is also a leader of the campaign to free Mumia, and also a key organizer and scholar and activist around the Young Lords. But here with us, and as I say your name, please come up to the stage. First we have Ian de Oliveira. Ian was a major national leader of the New Students for a Democratic Society. Not the old one, you can probably tell by looking at the face. He's not that, the new Students for a Democratic Society, and is now doing key work against police brutality in Utah. Ian, please join the stage. In my presentation, I'm actually going to say a couple of things about both of these next two presenters, so I'm not going to talk too much about them now, except to say that it's a tremendous honor for me to be sharing the stage with both of them. They were both key figures in my early years of activism, because I am so much very younger than they are, and they still remain key organizers in the movement today. First, the consummate coalition builder of our time, leader of the People's Climate Movement, coordinator of the historic June 12th, 1982 million-person mobilization on UN and Central Park for disarmament, coordinator of several of the key national lesbian and gay, bisexual and transgender demonstrations. I don't know, there's barely been a major national mobilization in the last 50 years that Leslie hasn't had some major role in. Please help me in welcoming Leslie Kagan. And I'm going to say a little more about Bob in my official presentation, which I think is going to start momentarily, so I'll say less about him now. But suffice it to say, on the little sheet that some people got, It just names a few organizations that Bob was part of. You know, not ones of any particular note. He was just a co-founder of the Black Panther Party, Illinois chapter, former director of Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, member of Congress on Racial Equality, logistics coordinator of the Millions Persons March, and of course, a leader of the All African People's Revolutionary Party, GC. Please help me in welcoming Bob Brown. And, we're just starting the panel now, so now I give my talk. Could you all move down one?
Sure.
All right. And I was told, put the mic a little below you so that in the video that's being made, it won't just look like the mic is on our heads. And in order to be careful about time, I've actually written out my remarks. I don't usually do that, but I'll try to remain close to time and also strict on what I'm saying. Well, it was 50 years ago today that Sgt. Pepper taught the Beatles to play and smoke and redefine themselves and mass culture. 50 years ago, Aretha spelled out her demand for R-E-S-P-E-C-T, and the Buffalo Springfield, for what it's worth, sang that something's happening here, but what it is ain't exactly clear. Some people, however, including Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., suggested that things were, in fact, getting very much clearer. Dr. King, with a little help from his friends, proclaimed 50 years ago his independence from the civil rights conservatives when he publicly questioned, and this is a quote from King, "What do the Vietnamese people think as we test out our latest weapons on them, just as the Germans tested out new medicines and new tortures in the concentration camps of Europe?" In calling for a true revolution, Dr. King's true friends included Vincent Harding, who helped write his historic Beyond Vietnam speech, and Stokely Carmichael, who was sitting in the first rows of Riverside Church cheering King on as he delivered it a little more than 50 years ago today. Perhaps more than any other leader of his time or since, Stokely, later known as Kwame Ture, embodied a nexus between Martin and Minister Malcolm X, between the strategic nonviolence of voter registration and the tactical arms carried by the Black Panthers for self-defense and defense of a people. Stokely was both chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and, just a few years later, honorary prime minister of the Black Panther Party. And it is a true honor tonight to be here with the one person who was with him through both of those experiences and beyond, Bob Brown of the AAPRP-GC. Fast forward 15 years. It was 30 years ago that three of us on this panel played our parts in the largest peace demonstration in U.S. history up to that point. 1 million people converging on the United Nations in Central Park, calling for an end to nuclear weapons and nuclear power, for nuclear freeze and complete disarmament, and for an economic conversion which would result in the meeting of all human needs. Despite this gray beard, I was, as I said, younger than the rest, only 19 at that time, and the representative of the U.S. Student Association and the Progressive Student Network to the June 12, 1982 mobilization. The huge numbers were the result of not one, but three distinct coalitions organizing for the event, which is why even now, some revisionist histories will falsely tell you that the demonstration was only or mainly for a nuclear freeze, which is kind of like writing, as one prominent pacifist just recently did for a major nonviolence-oriented website a month ago, that Dr. King was essentially a conservative thinker. The pacifist writer's thesis based solely on King's writings and actions up until 1963. It has long been my assertion that we re-assassinate King annually each January when we freeze frame him as if the years 1963 to 1968 never took place. We do similar injustices to all of our movement histories when we tell convenient lies and omissions which distort how real and ordinary people engage in very real organizing to make real and extraordinary social change. Tonight, reflecting on our movements and our own pasts in order to reaffirm our vital alliances today and imagine more effective work in the future, I want to focus on two revisionist history myths which are in dire need of myth busting. The first myth, intended to keep us from effective organizing, is that black people, maybe especially Kwame Ture, followed by many others, ordered white folks out of the civil rights and social justice movements, forced them out of SNCC, and generally brought about a dissolution of the beloved community which was coming together at that time. The legacy is clear, and it is based on a premise as false as it is destructive. The fact is that the Atlanta project of SNCC, recognizing that the main group representing black students had a number of white activists within it, set about a controversial challenge that white students interested in justice should focus their work in our own communities, thus also enabling students of African descent to take the unencumbered lead in theirs. There would be no bars to alliances, friendships, or strategic coalitions. There would just be a logical division of work and leadership. But logic and strategic action has not been a strong suit of the US left, especially when it involves people of European descent giving up leadership and power. To be sure, when I first met both Bob and Leslie at age 19, straight out of high school and eager to learn everything I could about people's movements, the alliances between Kwame's people and the next generation of those who led the Vietnam anti-war movement were in full bloom. The AAPRP had joined the coalition known as Mobilization for Survival, led by Leslie, and AAPRP militants Bob and Mawanasoa Koyate of the All-African Women's Revolutionary Union took positions on MOB's national and New York staff. I was thrown into the mix as a draft registration resistor, well aware that Kwame had both popularized the phrase Black Power and the slogan, "Hell no, we won't go." And though I was privileged to meet and later travel to North Africa with Kwame, I was truly embraced and mentored by Mawana and Bob, and later by Pan-Africanist pacifist Bill Sutherland, who had left the US altogether in 1953, living his days as an unflinching supporter of the African liberation movements and an unofficial people's ambassador between the continent and the diaspora. In part, those connections were personal and individual, but they were also very political in nature. I can't imagine that the AAPRP did all the work with us they did, primarily because they liked Leslie and me so much. There was always at the center of things a deep commitment to internationalism, which understands that the US is more of an empire and a prison house of internal and external colonies than it is a simple nation state with so-called racial minorities like Puerto Ricans, who, by the way, I can tell you from my time last week in Puerto Rico celebrating the release of patriot Oscar Lopez Rivera, very much think that Puerto Rico is their own country. Or Mexicans, who have borders and fences and walls built around them long before the current president suggested new constructions. It is an internationalism, the AAPRP's, centered on Pan-Africanism, which includes Africans in the US who are part of a mighty diaspora. And it is an internationalism which has never neglected the struggles of indigenous peoples, the Palestinians, and others, and which still provides, in my estimate, some of the most vital lessons for our collective future. So no, Kwame Ture and the inheritors of his legacy were and are not responsible for the splits between black and white, but are rather exemplars of radical alliance building. The second destructive myth I want to focus on tonight involves the nexus between Martin and Malcolm, and what some of us are now calling the false dichotomy between revolutionary violence and nonviolence. Going back to A.J. Musty, it was not necessarily him, the man himself, but more of his close associates. Despite differences between them, they all seemed to have a much less difficult time than many of us do today, dealing with those who didn't agree with them tactically, strategically, or philosophically. Their pre-Vietnam War era vision of anti-imperialism and revolutionary aspiration understood that alliances had to be built well beyond pacifists, peaceniks, and the middle class. Labor and students had to be key elements of any effective mass movement, and coalition building by definition meant working closely with people who one didn't agree with on some fundamental issues. Bill Sutherland perhaps put it clearest. It was not his job, even as a person of African descent who had dedicated his whole life to the liberation movements, to tell the people of Mozambique or Namibia or Zambia or Algeria or any way how best to wage their struggle. That arrogance was part of the Eurocentric paternalism he had sought to leave behind. In fact, Bill felt it was his and our main job to get the boot of US imperial capitalist aggression off the backs of all the peoples of Africa and the global South. As part of the War Resisters International and the Quaker-based American Friends Service Committee, Bill fought long and hard to ensure that all liberation movements received dedicated solidarity. He would, to be sure, support grassroots nonviolent efforts when they emerged, but as the literal host to both Martin in Ghana and Malcolm in Tanzania, he refused to choose on a personal as well as a political level between two essential positions which might both be necessary in overcoming the forces of reaction. Today, we may surely need to explore greater, more creative, and more militant forms of revolutionary nonviolence, but it is at best a dead end to preach that nonviolence, or armed struggle for that matter, are the only means to the revolution we clearly need. Today, technology allows us to communicate more quickly and efficiently with larger groups of people across longer distances and cultural economic divides. More than language or money, we need the political will and acumen to build the kind of diverse and decisive coalitions which can turn the tide away from the reactionary regimes of late neoliberalism. Some of that will can emerge from the long-lasting alliances forged after decades of trusted collaborative work. Some of that acumen can develop from scientific socialist analysis based on decades of real-world organization-to-organization party building. And some of the passion, energy, and creativity needed can and must be built from the visions, poetry, and power of the new voices and new generations. In any and all these cases, those assembled here tonight provide a good place to start, a good cross-section of peace and justice forces. As a long-time war resistor, a peace researcher and member of the Musty Board, and a proud descendant of the Musty legacy, I'm pleased to reassert our connection with and respect for the AAPRP-GC, to share in strategic conversation with Leslie, one of the most gifted US coalition builders of the last half century, and to build connections with all the younger folks here today. Forward ever, a change is going to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt, for that. That was amazing. Thank you. And thank you all for being here, of course. My name is Ian Teixeira de Oliveira. I come from Utah, here in the United States. Further than that, though, my family and I from Brazil, and that kind of is going to inform a little bit of what I'm going to talk about today, which is, generally speaking, what it means to be anti-war today. This is, again, anniversary of a very powerful, very important, and world-changing anti-war movement. So first, before I get into my little thing, I just want to take a moment to talk about little thing. So I'm talking about this because it's relevant. Before I got here, on my way over to over here, before I got on the train, I ran into some people who, stopped me in the street and was like, "Hey, can I talk to you for a second?" And, me being from kind of a small town, Utah, right, I stopped and, of course, I talked to them. I understand that that's not necessarily the mode of operation here, but I come from Utah, and that's what we do. We talk to people, I guess. So I talked to them, and they're from Amnesty International. I don't know if you all have heard about Amnesty International, but I'm sure you have, so I'll just continue with that. And, talk to them. They seem very nice. It's great. And I thought about something while I was talking to them. They, like a lot of people that I've met while I've been here in my short time, I flew in yesterday morning, asked me, "Hey, why are you here?" Right? I'm from Utah. Why would I fly thousands of miles out here, New York? Even speaking at a conference, right? It's like, okay, you flew 2,000 miles. Why are you here? I think what's more relevant, a question, is not necessarily why I'm here specifically from Utah to New York, but deeper than that. Why am I here in the United States? And this kind of ties into this conversation I was having a little bit ago with these Amnesty International people, because of the relationship between Western interventionalism and the sorts of, political instability, violence, etc., that happens internationally and locally. This is also important. So I think the answer to why I am here on a more broad scale as in the United States is more of an important one. I'm here because my father and some of his siblings were no longer safe in Brazil. My grandfather was in politics, et cetera, until about the 60s, about 65, when a military coup happened in Brazil, ousted the not very long elected president, Goulart, and my grandfather basically said, "Look," to my father, "you have to leave because this is no longer safe for you." What's not understood, really, even to a lot of Brazilians, is that this military coup was not just something that happened in Brazil. This is something that happens all over the world, in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, all over, especially then. And it happens more often than not under the guise of this type of humanitarian interventionism that, that these cats with Amnesty International were trying to talk to me about and stuff like that. And so when I think about why I'm here, it's because of that, because the United States and Britain in this particular circumstance decided that it was in their best interests, under the guise of humanitarian intervention, to come to my country to support a military coup that made the working class people in Brazil's life living hell. Okay, so this is why I'm here in the general. Why I'm here in the specific is, of course, because I was invited. Thank you very much. And because there is, I think, an understood important confluence between the work that I do in Utah. I'm an organizer with an organization called Utah Against Police Brutality. And in the name, of course, it's very obvious. we deal with specifically police violence. And in Utah, not very many people realize this, but police violence is very prevalent and very serious. And what needs to be understood, and I think those, of course, those with me do definitely understand this, is that the history of police violence has a very profound and essential confluence with the history of anti-war, okay? Very profound, very important, and an eternal relationship. So this is basically what I'm going to talk about from here on out, is that relationship and what it means to be actually anti-war here in the United States today. So I'm going to start with kind of an explanation of that and move forward from there with this statement. Never in the history of this country has there been any point in which this country has engaged in any type of interventionism, military action, police action, whether domestic, foreign, big or small, that has ended up that the net result, morally, ethically, economically, scientifically, has been positive. All right? This is an important fact. Never in the history of this nation has, when this nation decides that it has some moral obligation to go to another country or to go to your community or my community and engage in these types of actions, violent actions, military actions, or what you will, has the outcome been positive? Okay? And this is the same, this is very specific and very well understood in the so-called criminal justice system in the United States. You ask anybody who does any, study, is, learned in the criminal justice system in the United States, is one of the first things they're going to say is, well, criminal justice in the United States doesn't actually have any effect on criminality in the United States. And this is an important point, because then you have to kind of make the connection of, okay, so why does it exist? Why does policing exist? Why does the criminal justice system in the United States exist in the way it does? So these are, it's important to understand this kind of relationship between the external and the internal, and to understand that never again in the history of this country has in any point it engaged in an action that is violent, whether economic, whether political, or whether directly, through military violence, through bombing, through, shooting someone on the street, through any of these scenarios, has the result been positive, have had a positive impact. So, to be anti-police brutality here in the United States, this is what I claim, this is what I support, and I think if you analyze the situation historically, concretely, and contemporarily, this is what you will find. To be anti-police brutality in the United States today is to not only denounce the police violence domestically, but also to denounce the international policing of the United States, of NATO, and of its lackeys. Okay? This is essential. The police, whether international police in the military and locally, has always and will always be the direct enemy of working class people here and abroad. Never in the history of this country has there been any movement, has there been any situation in which someone, a working class person, has stood up and demanded a better world where the United States has not reacted with the utmost disgusting, despicable display of violence in the world. And never, as well, including, never has there been any situation in the history of this nation, has there been any situation in which another country's people has stood up and said, we want and we are making right now a nation in which does not rely on the United States or its Western allies, is not subservient, and will not support the actions that the United States makes domestically or internationally, of which the United States and NATO and its imperious lackeys have not responded, again, with the utmost violence. We've seen this again and again in Vietnam, obviously, in Korea, in Libya, in Syria, in Somalia, in Brazil, and even today in Venezuela, where the United States is supporting, has supported, and will continue to support anti-government, rightist, imperialist actions to attempt to exert its dominance on other nations. It is important to understand this, and it is important to understand its relationship on the local level in situations like police brutality. We have to understand that there is always that relationship, and that we need to feel that, we need to relate to that in a most profound sense. In all of us, from the beginning of oppression, there is always this fire in us. In all of us who are born into a world where we are subjugated, where we are unfree, there is a fire inside of us for liberation, for freedom, for a better world. The issue being, obviously, is that not all of us know how to express this, not all of us know how to actualize this, how to come to consciousness with this reality that is inside of us. And so one of the things that happens is we see something that happens outside of us, externally, internationally, locally, that ignites that fire. An example of this being Haiti. During the slave revolts, during the abolitionist movements in Haiti, or in the United States and in Haiti and all over the Americas, there was a primordial fire in all of them, of which through the brave, the revolutionary actions of the Haitians was ignited most profoundly. And through that, we had this explosion of revolutions all over the Americas. How much time? Okay, we're good. Okay. So I'm going to skip forward since we're running out of time. But this continues, and I think it is still very important to analyze, to look at, and to realize for ourselves in our movements locally. The reason I continue to bring this up, the reason I come here, the reason I go wherever and talk about the relationship between anti-police brutality work that I'm doing and of anti-war, hell no, we won't go, is because of that confluence. Because when, for instance, the World Cup riots were going on in Brazil, of which I was there for and I, analyzed very closely, one of the things that I noticed first when I went to one of the larger protests in Belo Horizonte. Lots of people there, big flags, everybody's very excited, everybody wants to make a change for the world. One of the biggest flags that was out there in Belo Horizonte was a Black Panther flag. And this is essential to understand that although it seems that we are alone when we work in our locals, when we work in our own communities to try to make a better world, to try to fight against these types of violence brought onto us by, in this case, the United States, we are connected, we are unified. There is a thread of the desire for freedom, for liberation, that is international, that goes through all working class people, oppressed, subjugated, everywhere in the world. Everywhere in the world. And so when a Brazilian raises the flag of the Black Panther, what they are doing is they're calling upon a history of liberation. What they are doing is they are calling upon the uniting of all Black Africans all across the world through the diaspora. What they are doing is they are calling upon not only their own liberation, their own desire to attain freedom in Brazil, but they are also calling upon the mass solidarity of all oppressed people internationally. Thank you very much. I appreciate the time.
My apologies for being late. So I thought I'd start out by reading a quote from a speech given by Martin Luther King in 1967 at the 11th annual convention of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And this is what he says. And this is, of course, the later king, the radical king, the king that we don't remember. Not the king who celebrated for his speech at, in Washington in 1963. And what's interesting is that I usually read this quote to my students, and I ask them, who do you think said this? And they always say Malcolm X. I want to say to you, as I move to my conclusion, as we talk about where do we go from here, that we must honestly face the fact that the movement must address itself to the question of restructuring the whole of American society. There are 40 million poor people here, and one day we must ask the question, why are there 40 million people, poor people in America? And when you begin to ask that question, you are raising a question about the economic system, about a broader distribution of wealth. When you ask that question, you begin to question the capitalistic economy. And I'm simply saying that more and more we've got to begin to ask questions about the whole of society. We are called upon to help the discouraged beggars in life's marketplace. But one day we must come to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. It means that questions must be raised. And you see, my friends, when you deal with this, you begin to ask the question, who owns the oil? You begin to ask the question, who owns the iron ore? You begin to ask the question, why is it that people have to pay water bills in a world that's 2/3 water? These are the words that must be said. Now, when I say questioning the whole society, it means ultimately coming to see that the problem of racism, the problem of economic exploitation, and the problem of war are all tied together. These are the triple evils that are interrelated. Um, when you were speaking, I was thinking of the relationship between police brutality and the power of the police and war, because often people see these things as disconnected, especially in the American context, because police violence is associated with black people. That's their problem. I'm thinking that around the world, from Israel to Haiti to Vietnam, when the United States has intervened abroad, its first line of defense has been to train local police forces. From the Tonto Macu in Haiti to the forces and police force of the Diem regime in Vietnam, because the police historically has been integral to repressing dissent, to essentially stopping people from rebelling against their government. And in the United States, in the case of African Americans, who are among the most targeted by the police, a community with a disproportionate experience with poverty because of racism, we also see that out of that community emerges the most powerful resistance movements that speak to people around the world, from Brazil to Palestine to Haiti. When black people, African Americans, rebel in this country, the world listens because they are rebelling within the empire. And these are people with a long history of repression that somehow everyone around the world understands and sees, but the people in the United States. So there's something quite powerful about black resistance and the symbolism it represents and the inspiration it carries for oppressed people around the world. And so, of course, that community has to be repressed. Not just economically, but with one of the most violent arms of the state, which is the police. So, in thinking about how I should cut this talk, I think the problem with anti-war movements and anti-war sentiment and anti-war politics in the United States has been that in some instances, parts of the left have supported U.S. intervention abroad. And I think it's important for the left in the United States to strengthen itself to make the argument that Martin Luther King makes, that essentially war is the engine of empire and capitalism. There's no other way to cut that, that fact. Beyond that, war strengthens and legitimizes the power of the state. War strengthens and legitimizes ideologically the power of a state that's invested in inequality, both at home and abroad. And I think that it's important in the United States, in a context in which the state has an enormous ideological power and the left has historically been weak, for us to make the connections of how, in fact, deploying war abroad, even if for humanitarian reasons, then strengthens the power of the state that is deployed against the people of the United States. And it's happened historically. We see this after World War II. After World War II, that was a humanitarian war. The state is strengthened exponentially so much that the United States becomes the hegemon. And what happens domestically is not an extension of freedom, as was articulated during World War II. We were fighting for freedom and democracy. What happens at home is a rabid deployment of repression against all people who are critical of the government. And we see that with McCarthyism. So the power of the state is emboldened, legitimized during World War II. That power then is deployed by the state to essentially strangle and kill the very dangerous movements that emerge in the United States in the 1930s. The labor movement, the anti-war movement of that period, and the period before of World War I. And the power of the working class, right? That's ultimately what was destroyed. You have in the 1930s the most powerful, one of the most powerful working class movements that actually paralyzed the nation, that brought us health care and decent wages and unions. And after the war, that movement is completely repressed, destroyed. Radicals are imprisoned and executed, the Rosenbergs. Then I'm thinking about the Vietnam War, a war that we lost. But that war too emboldened the state. And I'm just thinking about one example. There were quite a number of generals in the Vietnam War and top brass, in part one of the largest percentages in U.S. history, in part because the Cold War led to the exponential growth of the military, right? So you have the exponential growth of the military, and now you need more managers of that apparatus. So you have quite a number of managers, top officers, who need placement after the Vietnam War. Some of those top brass folks, in fact, end up becoming police chiefs across the country. And this is a history that I learned on the go when I was making a film about about Mumia Abu-Jamal and what had happened to the police and the expansion of law and order in the post-civil rights movement era. In any case, I learned that those officers who fought in Vietnam, who were placed as police chiefs across the country, were essentially entering a domestic civil situation, but they had actually been in war. So they, in fact, approached their civilian job with the mentality of war, which explains in part the transformation in the United States after the civil rights and black power movements and the anti-war movement of the 60s, of like the RoboCop standard that all Americans now accept. And in fact, you probably know that in the 1990s, the death penalty in Illinois was what's the word? It was put on hold. It was suspended. It was suspended because students at Northwestern University, journalism students at Northwestern University, discovered that the police department in Chicago had tortured confessions out of all of these men who were on death row, innocent people. And we later learned that the torture techniques used in these prisons in Chicago were learned in Vietnam and were used against Vietnamese prisoners of war do I have to wrap up? In Vietnam. So there are so many connections between the strategies and techniques of empire abroad and their impact domestically. But ultimately, I think we have to take a step back, and I mean, on the left, we need to be conversant in this history, but ultimately, where do we go from here? I think we have to accept and acknowledge that the organized left in the United States has been weakened by empire and the state. It was eviscerated through FBI maneuvers and through the homicidal violence of the counterintelligence program of the FBI, deployed against the Black Panthers, but also against many other groups. So the state, the left in the 60s won change. There was a cultural revolution, but the state, in fact, managed to break apart and destroy organizations. And it is organizations that carry the politics of anti-war, that carry the politics of class, the working class, that link capitalism domestically to what's happening in Brazil or Haiti or Syria or Iraq. So our task really is to rebuild the left. And the question is, how do we do that in this period? We have to rebuild organization, because organizations help identify the strategies that can bring about change, right? Without the civil rights movement would not have happened without SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Black Power would have not meant anything without the Black Panther Party. So organizations, and I say this because in the United States, because of McCarthyism and the many waves of Red Scares throughout American history, we have an allergic response to organization. Organization is associated with the manipulation, the political manipulation of individuals who are communists. But in fact, organizations help lead social movements and develop strategies that can win. So I think that part of the problem is that we have left organizations in the United States that are not rooted in community and in local organizing. The left has a politics that it very arrogantly upholds, but it talks down to the people about it's about the people. So there is this, arrogance, I think, among people with a theoretical understanding of the world and how it works, that is, it's like shooting yourself in the foot. And the only way to really unlearn this arrogance is by rooting yourself in a place and working with communities on campaigns or work in the labor arena. And that's really the challenge. So where do we go from here? I think that people on the left, we need to build organizations with a theoretical and political understanding of empire and war and capitalism. But our task is to root ourselves locally and engage in campaigns that affect people's lives over the long haul. And in the process of winning campaigns and fighting for reforms, we need to keep alive a vision of a completely new world without war. So that's my message for today. Oh, you can sit here.
Do you want these tables?
You can leave the tables, but we need your bodies. So I'll just narrate this transition as we make it ever so slightly. We asked people, and thank you for that, your message. It's a beautiful place for us to lift off because some people in this room have some ideas about where to go, and we've put them into some collective poems, a little bit about where we've been and where we're going. And we have a group of artists who are going to make this come together. We've got Naima on guitar and vocals. We're gonna scoot back. We're gonna make as much room as we possibly can. Yeah, well, you need a little more room than that, but you're gonna do some magic because we have Sister Brittany here, who's going to bless us with movement connected to the music and the words. And we are using the words that you gave us to share these two pieces. Is your vocal mic in a good spot? Okay. Is your body in a good spot? Can we ask everyone in the room to take a nice deep breath with us as we breathe in your words and share them back to you? So in and out. Fighting for Pan-Africanism, fighting for everything, our liberation, not only for our rights, I was fighting for our future.
I remember fighting not to forget, fighting for survival.
I remember fighting.
I remember fighting for, I remember fighting for, I remember fighting for, I remember fighting for.
I was fighting for Oscar Lopez. I wanted his freedom from prison because we need cooperative, revolutionary, feminist, anti-racist socialism.
I remember fighting for welfare rights, the freedom to create. I remember fighting for my mother's freedom, 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 freedom.
But I remember too, really fighting for my own brain in elementary school. My knees restless up under that desk. A and B tussled at the same time.
I remember fighting for, I remember fighting for.
Whoa, fighting for? Shoot, I was fighting against. I was fighting against
Capitalism,
imperialism,
neo-colonialism,
apartheid,
socialism.
even Zionism. I remember.
I remember.
I remember, I remember, I remember.
I remember.
I remember, I remember, I remember.
We remember.
I remember, I remember, I remember. I remember, I remember.
And if you don't, then we'll remind you.
what? Say what?
I believe in a world that looks like ready for a revolution.
A world at peace, based on justice, freedom, and equality. No longer dependent on extractive practices. Renewable energy, democratic principles, locally based, and interconnection of communities. I'm talking about old with modern conveniences.
I believe in a world that has less poverty, no racism, no racism. I envision unification, liberation of Africa, socialism, liberation, socialism, peace in the world.
I believe in a world that looks ready for a revolution. I believe in a world that looks like it's ready for a revolution.
Let me tell you, my world has exploded remains of the Pentagon building in the fallows of DC's ashes. 40 acres and a mule. I'm talking bicycles and electric cars relying on love and rubber bands, carrying out the marginalized leaderships of a new world.
I believe in a world that looks like an autonomous village of maroon leaders who govern themselves and uplift the oppressed.
We're colors that radiate and bounce to the rhythms of our souls. Free rainbows. The freedom of 15 Puerto Rican political prisoners. Free life-saving care for people living with HIV and AIDS.
I believe in a world that looks like it's ready for a revolution. I believe in a world that looks like it's ready for a revolution. Oh,
I believe in a world that looks like
Serenity
love,
looks like learning.
growing.
Spiritual
I believe in a world that looks like
looks like
us.
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 Looking a whole lot like us.
Us.
us, us,
You can say it with us now. What it look like?
us, 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 us,
Thank y'all. Artists loving you, loving back. Thank you for your words. Those were your words. We thank you. There's some yellow cards on your table should you want to write down a question in advance for the panelists as you've been hearing their presentations throughout the evening. We'll pass out some yellow cards for you to write down any questions you have. Matt, can you bring the panelists back up and just show your love again for these amazing artists?
So we need poetry and music, we need dance, but I think we also got some magic. So let's give some applause again to Signy, to Nejma, to Naima, and to Brittany. You know, part of the magic is thinking, and yes, people should get back on the stage while I'm saying this. Part of the magic is thinking, oh, well, these four, you know, like, they do like 3 or 4 gigs a week, right? I mean, obviously, they're a touring company. And this is obviously stuff that they've been writing and rehearsing for months. But of course, as you know, those of you who were here early, these were words that you wrote, that we wrote earlier today. And Brittany, Signy, when's the last time you all saw each other? It's been a little while. It's not a... They don't do 4 gigs a week is what I'm saying. So thank you for the magic, and let's hear another round of applause for the 4 of them. Back to our panel, Leslie and then Bob.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Oops. Let's see. How do we, Okay. All right. Hi, everyone. First, let me thank. I'm not sure who to thank. I'm not totally sure who put this together, but thank you for putting it together and for not only having, inviting me to come, but to be part of this incredible panel. I feel quite honored to be sitting here with you and hearing from you. And maybe I'll be really short so I can hear more from you all. I think that's an important lesson of the last 50 years, is that we have to find the ways to listen to each other a little more deeply than we have sometimes. First, also, let me just say I apologize in advance, but by 9 o'clock I have to leave. So I don't want anybody to take offense or feel that I'm being rude, just giving you a heads up. I was working this spring on a demonstration in Washington, the end of April, the March for Climate, Jobs, and Justice. And it's what I'm often doing, working on a demonstration. Sometimes they're big, sometimes they're small, but it's one of the things I do. And somebody said to me, a younger person, said, "Oh, how long have you been doing this?" Organizing demonstrations. And it occurred to me that the first big demonstration I worked on was 50 years ago. And it was the Pentagon demonstration, where some people had the idea that they were going to levitate the building. It didn't quite happen that way. I think most of us knew it wasn't going to happen, but it really didn't matter. The point was that people were using their imagination and their energy and their people power to stand up, and in that case and in many other cases to sit down, to put their bodies on the line, to say no. In that particular instance, it was no to the war in Vietnam. But we knew then, and I think we learned even more as time went on, that demonstration and the work we did 50 years ago could not have happened had there not been not just weeks and months and years, but decades of struggle in this country and around the world that laid a foundation for us. And even in, some of us were pretty young then, but even then, we knew that it doesn't just happen, that one day you have a demonstration. It comes from someplace. It grows out of previous organizing experiences. And in that work, for many of us of my generation who kind of came of age during the Vietnam War, and that was a cornerstone of our activism. It wasn't the only thing that we worked on, but it was a foundational piece. We knew that doing that work would not have been possible in the immediate historical view without the work of the Civil Rights Movement and the Black Freedom Movement. That we were literally standing on the shoulders of the people who organized and struggled and fought, and sometimes, all too often, gave their lives in that work and in that movement. And it wasn't as if it wasn't like we all got a lesson. Right? We had to piece that history together. We had to learn it from different places, and sometimes it was harder and sometimes it was easier to get that history, but it was very uneven how we learned our own history. And I'm not sure why it was so uneven, but it was. And different people learned different things. But what I'm trying to say here is that we learned those lessons and the new lessons in the work we were doing because we were engaged in struggle. It wasn't like sitting at home and reading a book. Now, let me say something. I believe in reading books. I am not opposed to learning history or learning science or you stretching your imagination or whatever it might be, right, from the experience of reading. It is still an important piece of the human reality. But that's not the only way we learn. And for me, and again, for many people in my generation, I can't speak for all of us, obviously, we learned because we were engaged in struggle. I came to, like I said, I came of age in the anti-war period of the Vietnam War, and I got involved in that movement largely because I grew up in a kind of activist family. Some of my earliest memories were going to ban the bomb demonstrations in the 50s, and my parents going off to Washington for demonstrations to oppose the execution of the Rosenbergs. And so I grew up in that kind of climate, and I'm very happy that I had that experience. But I got involved in that work because, in a very naive and almost simplistic kind of way, I thought that one of the problems with the war in Vietnam, aside from the fact that we had no business being there, was that little wars can lead to big wars, and bigger wars can lead to nuclear war. And that was, I grew up in the shadow of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That was a terrifying thought, the thought of nuclear war. And I must say recently, that terrifying thought has reemerged with the world we live in today. So I and I think many of my peers entered that struggle against that war in a very kind of naive place. Not a bad place, and I think our motivation was good, but it was kind of naive. But in the course of that work, we learned a whole lot about why the U.S. was in Vietnam and where else the U.S. had been and was. And that laid a foundation for a much deeper understanding and a deeper commitment to the ongoing work. And I think many of us knew that regardless of what would happen in Vietnam, that our work would not be over once that war would end. And that was just a first step into a much bigger analysis and a bigger commitment to a broader and deeper struggle. So again, I come back to that. The major thing I'm trying to say here is that we learned by being engaged in the struggle. We learned from each other, we learned from reading, we learned from teachings, we learned from a whole lot of sources and places, but we had to be open to learning. We always had to be open to learning, otherwise we would just stagnate. We wouldn't go anywhere. So there's no time tonight to go over a complete 50-year history. A lot has happened in this country, in our communities, in the world. But that work of 50 years ago helped lay another level, another kind of foundation that allowed us, and again, many of us struggled very hard to make this happen, to understand some of the issues that needed to be connected, some of the dots that needed to be connected if we were going to make sense of the world we lived in. And we began to understand, and it still is a learning process, at least two very central things that I want to mention. One is how in the fabric of this country is the reality of racism. That it is not just one item on a list of problems. It is core to the air we breathe in this country. It is a foundational piece of how this country was, quote, built. From the massacre of the native peoples to slavery and so much more, it has persisted while it has reinvented itself and plays out in different ways at different moments in history. It has persisted, and it's still, I am sad to report, still very much alive today. That the racism is still here, and like I said, it's almost like in the air that we breathe, unfortunately. At the same time, of course, the fight against racism has always been there too. And at times there have been incredibly important victories, incredibly important hard-won struggles in the fight against racism. We have not yet found the way. We have not yet built a movement that's strong enough to actually bring that down, to topple that system. But inroads have been made, advances have been made. So life is different, and yet the problems persist. The other thing that we have learned over those 50 years, and again, I'm just mentioning two, there are a whole lot of lessons, is that the fabric of militarism and violence, armed state violence and militarism, is also interwoven in every aspect of the culture and the life of this country and our international policies. Unfortunately, the peace movement, the anti-militarism movement, the anti-war movement, whatever you want to call it, has at times been strong and at times been weak. It kind of comes and goes. I don't know why it's been so hard for us to really hold on to that as an anchor to the movements that we need. But the many-faceted nature of militarism and state violence, and by state I mean city, federal, national government violence, it's here in our own communities, it's here on a national level and an international level. Wars are big and small, but they are always going on. There is always a struggle for peace to be waged. And we have not yet figured out, unfortunately, just as we've not yet figured out how we're going to topple the reality of racism, we have not yet figured out how to make a real dent in that, what, of all people, Dwight D. Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex. He was right. There is a military-industrial complex, and it's, that's a simple way of saying it, but how do we, really tackle that? And again, it plays out. We see it from, the police brutality issue, and any single act of police abuse and of police violence, whether it's one cop shooting or beating one kid, or it's 1,000 cops arresting, 10,000 people, whatever level it's on, it's an offense. I mean, it is something that must be challenged and stopped, taken as seriously as we take anything else. A lot of this is brought together, I think, today in this security state that we live in. And it is, since World War II especially, has been refined and strengthened, and I don't even think we know the half of it about how it really works, especially with all the new technologies. Perhaps some of these new investigations into the Trump administration will reveal some more insights, who knows. But I just want to, I know my time is short here, so I just want to say one or two other quick things here. One is that we have, through this 50 years, also have had to understand the incredible flexibility and staying power of the state and capitalism. They have been able to reinvent themselves and adjust, and we have got to be nimble in that kind of way too. We have got to be smart. It's not enough to just be committed and have a good political perspective. We have to be smart and creative and bold in how we do our work. And within that, finally, let me just say three very short things. One, we have to integrate into this analysis a much deeper understanding of the role of gender and sexuality. It remains a missing piece, I believe, in our work. Two is that we have to, and the older I get, the more I believe this, we have got to those of us who are older, we have got to step aside and let the young people step up and take leadership. We just have to. And the young people, there's incredible energy from young people in this country now, but we need even more of that from young people. And then third, to say what several have already said, is that our commitment to solidarity on an international level has to be redoubled. The world is extremely small. I do a lot of work these days on the climate crisis, and that has kind of refocused my understanding of how small the world is, and that the problems we face really are global. And so we need a movement that tackles racism integrates these other concerns and issues, tackles militarism head-on, and does that in a global way, but starts from building at the community level, building our community organizations, our community groups, and that on some level, I mean, it is terrific to see what is now called the resistance to the Trump, and it's not just Donald Trump, it's all those other players with him, the resistance to that, but it's not enough. We have got to not only resist the bad things, we have to put forth a vision and a model, a set of models of how the world can be different by the ways we work together to make sure it is different. It's both resisting and constantly looking forward to what this new world that we envision can actually be through our solidarity and our commitment to that activism. That's it.
Can I first ask how much time, what time is it now?
I think you have 4 hours.
No, I don't have that much time left. No, because Leslie has to leave before 9, and hopefully will leave by 9:15 to catch my 19-hour bus ride to Chicago and whatnot, and I got to be on that bus for a lot of personal and political reasons. I have a presentation which our party, the All African People's Revolutionary Party, GC, wrote, but somehow I keep leaving it.
In the mic.
I keep leaving it on the table on behind. Like Nina Simone and Leti Mbulu and Melanie McCabe, I can't give the same speech at the same time. So what I would like to do so that we can maximize the amount of audience participation we can, just try to summarize this real quick, make a couple of quick points in response to some of the stuff we've heard. Leslie said she didn't quite know how this program was put together and by whom. Let me say very quickly, Matt Horton at the University of California, that's Matt Meyer, an Irishman named Matt Horton, who was a graduate student, tried to organize this program October 29, 1966 at Berkeley, the 50th anniversary of the Black Power Conference at Berkeley, and whatnot. Unfortunately, it was sabotaged. Eon tried to bring it to Salt Lake City, Utah. Unfortunately, it was sabotaged, and we know who did it. It's just not time to discuss that principally right now, more than just name names, because you also have to talk about why. In conversations, I raised it with Matt. Matt said, bring it to New York. That's why we're here. That's number one. Number two, for us, this is more an electronic program than it is an on-site audience one. Our youth can sit in a studio with nobody but the band and the technicians and cut a record that can sell 1 million around the world in seconds because they have a fan club, because they have a network. Well, we don't exaggerate our capacity. We don't have it, but we're struggling as best we can to build it. If Martin Luther King went to jail, Marcus Garvey went to jail for trying to use the mails in the 1920s, and I went to jail for using the telephones, then we must, in the 21st century, use this electronic vehicle and spread it as much as we can. In our vision, in our view, we are celebrating the 50th anniversary of 1967, which we believe that the peace movement went over to the critical mass. There's always been a peace movement. There's always been war. And we can go back generations and millenniums to talk about the various wars and their causes and consequences around the world. So there's always war, and there's always been a peace movement. And we have fundamental differences with those people who confuse movement and organization. Those folks who tell us that we are not, because we are not in the so-called left, and I don't even know what that is. I consider it leftovers and whatnot, because we have never been considered to be a part of the left. our organization and movement has been attacked by the entire alphabet soup of the left. We even have people in the peace movement, some of them dear friends of ours, who tell us the peace movement was white, and that African people and Hispanic and Latino people and other forces were marginal at best, or had no role in helping build this movement, which always existed, just needed to be brought up and taken to the mass. And for us, 1967 represents a critical period, which that movement, which had existed for years, you know, no one can deny the peace movement in 1917 and the role of the Socialist Party, you know, before the Communist Party. Nobody can deny it. And nobody can deny that that movement was crushed, but it continued to exist. And one can see the relationships. You know, I am into generational history, millennial history. I don't care about decades, you know, 1960s, 1930s. Respectfully, SNCC would have come into being whether or not the individuals who sat in at Greensboro, because it is the people who make the movement. It is not the individuals or the organizations inside of the movement. I disagree with the narrative history that has been written about SNCC and the Panther Party. How can somebody write about something that I played some small little part in? Let us roll it quick. 1967 was critical because at that moment in time, the baby boomers, the children born in 1946 had become 18 by 1964. I am born in 1948, became 18 by 1966. There could not have been a peace movement to the degree it was. There could not have been any of that if there wasn't that bulge. The people went many different ways. Some went to the Marines, some went to the missionaries, some went to the movement, some went to the mafia. We know in Chicago that history. We lived it and we're gonna write it. And no one is going to interpret that for us. It could not have been done with youth pitted against elder people. We know the history of A.J. Musty in this movement. A.J. Musty, who joined the Fellowship of Reconciliation in 1917, who was a co-founder of the Congress of Racial Equality in 1942. I joined CORE in Chicago 21 years later. And when I walked in the door, the first thing they told me is A.J. Musty and pacifism and Satyagraha. I don't quite know how many so-called pacifists today even know the word and whatnot, but leave that aside. A.J. Musty, those people who say that there is no connection between the peace movement and the civil rights movement are at best fools, liars, or agents. They know nothing about the history of our struggle. They didn't participate in it, and they ain't read no books about it, except books that regurgitate the same old narrative. A.J. Musty is critical. It is A.J. Musty who founded CORE. It is A.J. Musty who worked with Kwame Nkrumah, with Sekou Touré, with Martin Luther King, with all kind of forces. We don't have time. We put some in here. But it seems to me that within that struggle, we must find organizations and institutions. We must find individuals who embody the best of that movement, the best of that struggle, and try to see what they did and how they did it so we can see what we must do. We are here and we chose who to come here with. We work with UNAC, we work with all the different peace forces in this country who will work with us. And it ain't many. But leave that aside. We deliberately asked and are honored to come here to be with the A.J. Musty Institute because we know the role, the critical role it has played not only in the peace movement, but the labor movement, the socialist movement, the civil rights movement, and other movements throughout. We would not be here with anybody else tonight. That's number one. We know the critical, some of the points we believe that took the movement over to the mass. We calculate April 1967 as the dialectical moment when it moved to the mass. And we can quote the various polls to show, plotted. April 4, King, A Time to Break Silence. We wanted to quote two of the passages. One paragraph that talks about the hatchet men, the Uncle Toms, and the Aunt Jemimas within our community who said, do not mix civil rights and peace. And he spoke to them why he had to come out. We also, in the paper, we took it out because it would be too long. But in the paper, he says 7 reasons why he came out against the war at Vietnam. We like especially the 3rd reasons. He said for 3 summers, for 3 years, especially the summers, he had traveled through every ghetto in the United States, meeting angry young men. That's where that phrase comes from. He the one labeled us angry young men. They added black. 50 years later, I'm an angry old African, which speaks about my progression. He spoke about how he goes into these ghettos. He tells these youth with Molotov cocktails and rifles in their hand that nonviolence is the way. At every city, he is confronted by angry young men with draft cards in their hands who ask him, what about Vietnam? I threw mine in his face and then sat at his knees. Sat at his knees. You cannot come to Chicago, one of the most violent cities then and now, and ask us to be nonviolent with police killing us, and you ain't said nothing about the draft. We pushed him. We pushed him. And he was dead 1 year later. He told us that if every Negro in America abandons nonviolence, he will be nonviolent to his death. We told him we'll build a funeral pyre for you. We didn't burn for Malcolm. This nonsense, this so-called dichotomy between revolution and self-defense and nonviolence is BS. We did not burn for Malcolm. We named schools for him all over this country, parks, some of which that still exists. Within 4 hours, 125 cities were up in flames. And we were accused of doing it. We did not. We were extremely nonviolent. With police and FBI surrounding us, what else could we do? What else could we do? This history is incorrect. It is totally incorrect. That's April 4th. April 12th, Kwame Ture was at Tougaloo, Mississippi, Tougaloo College in Jackson, Mississippi, with hundreds of students standing up for 10 minutes saying, hell no, we did not, we ain't going. He didn't coin the phrase, like he didn't coin the phrase Black Power. Frederick Douglass said it 70 years before he did, in a speech called The Doom of Black Power. It was the May 2nd movement with Bill Epton and the Progressive Labor Party in Harlem that coined that phrase in 1964. But Kwame did help popularize it. He took it onto the college campuses. He took it into the African community and took that videotape of Tougaloo represents, in my view, the dialectical moment when that slogan became the anthem of the anti-draft movement. And there are kids running around the world who were saying, hell no, we don't go, and don't even know where it came from. Weren't even born. It is very good that they're saying it, even though they have not read. And there ain't nothing written to read that could tell them the truth about what it was. Let's keep rolling. April 15th, 300,000 people marching from Central Park to United Nations and marching in and she was there. I wasn't there because my mother wasn't going to let me go. And
I was 3 years old.
Yeah, and I had to babysit. I had to babysit, no question, but I wasn't there. But Martin Luther King was, Jim Bevel was, AJ had died in February, Dave Dillinger was, Norma Becker, I mean, a whole...
And Kwame.
And Kwame Ture. Kwame Ture marched from Central Park to United Nations with a contingent of white kids under a Viet Cong flag saying victory to the Viet Cong, and he was never invited back to speak, especially after the June War, the June Israeli War, and SNCC's position against Zionism. He was never invited back. But that is the moment, that is the largest at that point in time. The October 67 Pentagon, only reason why Kwame wasn't there was because he was on a world tour. And of course he wasn't invited. No problem. But that's water under the bridge. We move on. Because it's not about who likes who or nothing else. 13 days later, Muhammad Ali refused to be drafted because he got no quarrel with the Viet Cong, and the Viet Cong never called me a nigger. In the book that you helped co-edit, in the introduction with Vincent Harding, Cornel West, in the introduction, he says that 72% of white America and 55% of black America disagreed with King, at that point in time on the question of the war. They supported the war. Well, Cornell left Ali out, left Kwame out, but we forgive him because we've done our own research. Within 1 year, 39% of the U.S. population opposed the draft. And we picked that particular Harris poll because it spoke to the draft. Now, we want to know what explains that change in public consciousness and, more importantly, in public conscience. Because it's not just consciousness, it's also conscious. No one can say that Trump, Hillary, and Obama are not conscious. What is their consciousness? What are their values? What is their essence and whatnot? Our argument is that it went to the critical mass. We do too quick on the other ends, two bookends. In 1959, the French announced the test of the first French atomic bomb in Algeria in the Sahara. Bill Sutherland, War Resistance League, AFLC, that whole network, went to Ghana. Kwame Nkrumah's government under Ghana put all the resources at their disposal to organize demonstrations from Ghana up into Algeria to protest that stuff. Demonstrations were held in Britain, in 10 countries. French army stopped it. Leave it aside. In April of 1960, Kwame Nkrumah and Secretary Ray convened a conference on peace and security in Africa. And they declared Africa the first nuclear-free zone in the world. I am anti-nuke, always been anti-nuke, but I support the right of Korea to defend itself. I supported the right of China to defend itself. I'm against the nuke. I'm against the exploitation of uranium miners in Africa to produce the nukes and whatnot. That's a bookend on that side. I'll do this and I'll stop. 16 years later, 15, I met Leslie and Matt. I worked with Leslie. I don't agree with the history of what happened and how we didn't come back. That's another story. I learned much more. It's my first major national demonstration that I participated and helped learn. But 13 years later, on paper at least, I was a coordinator and a director for the Million Man, not person, man march. Let's interpret history correctly and then our differences. Million Man March. And the first 2.5 million stay-at-home campaign, which was the largest general strike in the history of the United States. And in conclusion, I remember Dr. Benjamin Chavis Muhammad and I were discussing what to do with the permits. Where to put the stage and the budget and blah, blah, blah. And I said, let me call Leslie. And I remember two things. Leslie said, Bob, do not let the police tie you up for months debating on how many black angels can fit on the head of a pin. I said, thank you. Police told us we can't get 1 million here. I said, okay, here's 25 sites in Washington, D.C. Put 1,000 here, put 500 there, put 2 million there. It's called creative dislocation, according to Martin Luther King. You know, and they said, oh, you're dispersing your people. I said, no, we're dispersing your police. They gave us the permit. I remember we had a debate about a $500,000 stage on 3rd Street. And I called Leslie, and Leslie, we went through the line item, piece by piece, to the nuts, to the bolts, to the, and whatnot. And we said, okay, we put the stage on the U.S. Capitol steps, and it only cost us $5,000. I'm finished. We are here tonight not for a speech. We are here to say a coalition has existed for years, for centuries, between some of the forces who are represented on this platform and in this audience. We have 3 generations, I believe, here. The 70s, the 40s, and the 20s. You know, give or take a few years and whatnot. This is a generation that brought us here. We came to celebrate this coalition, which we say always exists and has been principled and dialectical. And we come and say, now is the time. It's not the time to retreat and retire. My funeral will be my last demonstration. And those followers of Martin Luther King who abandoned nonviolence will not be invited. And you don't want me to name names. It ain't just the left or parts of the left who sold out. It's parts of the African community who is sold out as well. On this question of war, this question of peace, this question of capitalism.
I think people of color are integral to the left, whether the other left acknowledges it or not.
Of course, the leftovers. Of course, agreed.
Let's just take a moment to give Leslie and Bob a round of applause. Now, the good news is that we have over a half hour for conversation. The bad news is that in 7 minutes, Leslie and Signy are going to leave, and in 21 minutes, Bob is going to leave. However, but who's counting? However, let's begin it. And also Brittany, who's an amazing person, in addition to her dancing, has already had to leave. But Nejma, I would love for you to come up here if you don't mind, because I know you've spoken at panels. You know, I'm just saying, some people leave, some people join. You don't have to say anything just because you're up here, but you know. And I don't know if you'd be willing. I'd bring Signy up here as well, but then it'll look worse when she leaves in 3 minutes. So I'm going to just stand up. You sit down. Oh, you got to leave. Oh, he's just going to the restroom. We're going to let him do that, but he's going to come back. Don't tell anyone. He's just going to the restroom. It's okay. Oh, I'm sorry. This is going to go out live. Ian, I'll be back. So who wants to start us off? Some questions, some conversation, and we're going to let Leslie give the first response and answer because she has to leave the fastest. And if you're asking a question, I'd love for you to come up here as well, because this is a spot where, or I'll repeat it.
Comments, thoughts, feelings?
All right. And if you want, tell us who you are.
Sure. Hi, I'm Andrea. Excuse my ignorance, but I just wasn't aware of the stay-at-home campaign, and I think that's a brilliant idea, and I just wanted to hear a little bit more about that. You said there's 2.5 million people stayed at home. I was just curious as to what that was about.
Can we hold that until some of the other questions that are particular to the individuals who have to leave sooner?
All right, so let's have a couple of questions and comments. We'll bunch them together. And you have some of the written cards, do you?
No one wrote them down.
Do they get credits? Do they get points taken away for that?
So just because I know you have to leave, Leslie, and we'll leave together in a moment, 2 things really. So you talked about stepping away and making room for younger generations to step up and also still staying in the fight. So that's part 1. What keeps you still in the fight today, number 1? And then number 2, you talked about how we need to talk about gender inside of this work. And we certainly in A New Black Arts Movement talk about the role that gender plays to keep people subservient, and that it would be awesome if we got rid of gender in many ways, which is a crazy idea to some. So maybe in your couple minutes, those two things.
Sure. Are there any other questions? Any other question? Bob has one.
Want to take one more question? Or
Yeah,
comment?
Bob has.
Yeah, I wanted to say something about and also ask a question about Leslie's comment in passing that at different periods the anti-war movement has ebbed, but we don't know why. Now, I don't think she meant that literally, because I'm sure she has plenty of ideas, but I think it's really important for us to think about what those reasons are, because they speak to the resilience and intelligence of this imperialist system. And if we look just at the most recent decline and collapse of the movement after 2006, 2007, it's a combination of the old strategy of withdraw U.S. troops, combat troops, in order to lessen the casualty rate and therefore the opposition among the U.S. population, but then also really critical in destroying the movement with the election of Barack Obama and the complete sowing of illusions and a false narrative that this was a change in the way power was dealing with the world, that imperialism now had a humane face, and that there was going to be a new change in direction that allowed the movement, which had always been too close to the Democratic Party in the first place, to now completely collapse. So I just wanted anyone on the panel, to address those issues.
And I'll just say before you do, I asked people to say their names, and you didn't do that, so I'll do it for you. That's Bob Leder of Resistance in Brooklyn and WBAI, but I'm also going to say his name because at the end of this evening we'll do announcements about upcoming events, and Bob is central to organizing another major anniversary. He's a key leader of New York ACT UP, and they're having a 30th anniversary, a special forum in June around some of the hidden history and myths of that organization. So Bob Lederer.
Thanks. Okay, let me try and do this real quick. And again, I apologize that I have to leave. It's forces bigger than me that create that. Anyway, why I stay in it, I think I would literally go crazy if I didn't stay in it. I feel like I know too much. I don't know enough, of course. There's so much more to learn. But I just, to sit and watch the news every day and not do anything, it would literally make me crazy. That's part of it. The other part of it is that there are plenty and, countless examples in history where people staying in it and working together actually have made a difference, actually have changed the course of history. We haven't won yet in terms of, completely redoing the world the way it needs to be redone, but there's enough of those positive lessons in history that also inspire me. And it's yes, there are the names that we know, but it's the nameless people. It's the people whose names we'll never know that most inspire me. Right, that their own humanity, their own commitment to changing the world, bettering not just their own lives, but the lives of their communities and people around them. That is what inspires me and keeps me going. On the gender front, that also is requires a whole other session, but I think that. There are, for all the problems and weaknesses and limitations of a women's movement that has been seen as, and in some organizational forms has been largely white, although certainly the fight for the rights of women and the humanity of women is not only in the hands of white women, and never has been, but that work has uncovered another layer, another type of system of power and oppression. And that if we are talking about the liberation of people and reimagining the world we live in, then we have to uncover all of those layers of power, of oppressive power. And we can't say something is going to wait till after the revolution to be dealt with. We're never going to make that full revolutionary set of changes unless we uncover not only all of those dynamics, but how they all intersect with one another, how they reinforce one another. So the way, I believe, the way race plays out, for instance, in this country, or class plays out, is deeply influenced and shaped by the reality of gender oppression, and vice versa. They all impact each other. So it's a critical piece of what we need to do. It's not just an add-on that we'll get to later. And then finally, on Bob's point about sort of the staying power of the peace movement, if you will, and what, yes, I have some thoughts about why and how it ebbs and flows. And I do think that it's an interesting piece of history or pieces of history to look at, where, you know, often people on the left have said that folks are most active and most committed to struggle when it's in their own self-interest. And yet some of the largest, most vocal and militant movements in this country's history, certainly since the end of World War II, have been anti-war struggles, and where people, I never went to Vietnam. I was never going to be drafted. You know, I didn't have that direct, it didn't impact me in that kind of very profound, direct way. And yet I, as a representative of, again, my peers, you know, we still were completely moved by that struggle. And I think it had to do with solidarity, that we understood that people are people, right? And bombs, well, we don't have to go into all of it, but that, so that's I think one thing we have to uncover more of is when are those moments of international solidarity vibrant, and when are they a driving force, and when do they take a back burner? And clearly there's a relationship between what's going on domestically at home and what's going on in terms of foreign policy. They are so connected and interwoven with one another. I do think, just very quickly on your specific reference to the election of Barack Obama, I think it was an extremely telling moment for, in terms of the kind of pretty strong anti-war movement we built around the Iraq War, and how quickly that dissipated once, you know, Obama took office. In fact, during the election season, it began to really wane, and the financial resources that went into his campaign, that literally anti-war groups had to close shop. They didn't have money coming in, right? I mean, it was that obvious and that profound. I think it's complicated, though. The fact of this country electing the first African-American president, with all of the political limitations of that man, all the disagreements we might have, that was history-making. I mean, that was kind of shocking that this country would elect an African-American man. And compared to George Bush, there was a kind of sigh of relief that I think a lot of activists had, including activists in the anti-war movement, who somehow put blinders onto the fact that basically he thought the Iraq War was the wrong war, that we should have been fighting harder in Afghanistan. That was his major critique of the Iraq War, was that it was the wrong country that we were in, not that we shouldn't have been at war. So I think there are lots of things that go into that, but the ebbs and flows of the peace movement, I think, are somewhat, to some degree, impacted by how deep or how shallow the understanding is at any given moment between what's going on domestically and what's going on the foreign policy front. And how, again, the militarism that is so core to what this country is about, you know, how it plays out both domestically and the foreign policy front. And I think sometimes people get engaged in a particular struggle against a particular war and forget that that war is part of a larger system. So when that war seems to be winding down, or there are less U.S. casualties, let's put it that way, then they kind of pull back and forget. So it's just a reminder of how much more we need to do the political educational work about really where these wars come from and how they're tied to our own domestic policies. So I know there's a lot more to say on all of that, but again, I'm very sorry, but I do have to leave. It's great being with you all tonight, though. Thank you.
Bob, do you want to take the question?
I agree with a lot that has been said, especially that Leslie has said, but I totally disagree on the issue of Obama. And it's perhaps because she's not black and she wasn't born or raised and struggled in Chicago that she does not understand who and what he was and is from the moment his father came into Hawaii to go to school. Leave that aside. I'm still in the movement at 69. I'll be 69 June 5 for a lot of reasons. Reason number one is I do not agree with this ideological paradigm that says some of us, when we get old, have to step aside. A.J. Musty did not step aside. He was 90 or maybe 100 years old when he died, and he had spent 50 years in the movement. Nobody asked A.J. Musty to step aside. People lift up Ella Baker. Ella Baker was not a 20-year-old teenager when SNCC was created. I don't quite remember her age, but I know she was old enough to be their mother or their father. I mean, their mother, grandmother. Some people say she didn't run SNCC, but fundamentally, she wasn't authoritarian, but that's because you ain't never had your grandmama roll her eyes at you. All they had to do is roll their eyes, suck their teeth, and you know it's time to quit because you know what's getting ready to happen if you don't. It's called informal power. It's called soft power. You know, I done been in too many meetings. I started the youngest in the room at 15, and I know the dynamics of youth in the movement. And now I'm one of the oldest. And they tell me, shut up. No problem. I told folks in my day, shut up. If it takes a whole village to raise a child, then why does it take the whole village to create revolution? You don't, I mean, we do ask, but they don't tell George Soros to step down. They take money from him. They don't say they don't want old money. And he the enemy of the people around the world. You know, they don't, yes, we might not vote for Johnson and for this Trump fool and whatnot, but why you gonna send babies against old fools? I'm not gonna step aside. My role will be constantly redefined as the movement is redefined as people age, people develop, people grow, people die. You got no problem with a family reunion, and you bring all the members of the family together, and sometimes they go for separate rooms. Why then can't we view the revolution? This stuff was imposed on us by funding agencies, and I will expose them. It is a lie. It is incorrect. The gender forces, yes, there has been oppression, exploitation, sexism in every movement in this country at every point in every history and now. But when you say the women's movement was white, you disrespect Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth. And I forget which one, but one of them went to the women's meeting in Seneca Falls and said, ain't she a woman too? Women who were treated as chattel property, as non-human, had to go to a white bourgeois women's union meeting for that time to assert and ask, aren't they human? Aren't they women? So my first problem is we just need to chunk out some of this nonsense and just look at it from a very fundamentally different kind of way. Black Lives Movement has an obligation to go to the streets in Chicago. But hell, I was in the streets, the same one, sitting in 50 years ago. And we can argue whether their sit-ins were better than our sit-ins. You know, we jumped in front of Mack trucks and we went to jail and we did all of that. You know, it is a generational question. I remember the anarchists of the 1960s who went to the streets. It is time for the children and grandchildren of the anarchists to go to the streets and of the left and whatnot. It's not a question of either or. So if young people cannot march with old people on this street corner, push the old folks out there in wheelchairs and hospital beds, and let them demonstrate and sit in and protest on this corner. Why has it got to be an either or? This is pushed on us. And we need to look carefully at the origins and where it has come from and how it has been used positively and negatively. Man told me in the 1960s, don't trust nobody over 30. And I asked him how old he was. He said he was 29. This is confusion. I mean, I understand the impulses, you know. I understand I was tired of them old folks in the civil rights movement too. You know, I still have computer lists of people I hope die in the morning. I read the obituaries every chance I get just to see if certain people are gone, because they may have been positive, but they now represent obstacles and whatnot in our path. It's all dialectical. But this notion that we got one single movement, you know, yeah, we have, but then some of us relate to more than one movement. And we must see this intersection, not just between the issues, but also between the people who are working in all those places. Maybe they are the best ambassadors, you know, who can try to bring these movements closer together. So no disrespect, but I ain't having no funeral. But if we have memorials, they're gonna be demonstrations. Let me go. You wanna push me out anyway, let me go. But you wanna celebrate me, then you're gonna come to the streets, else you just stay at home and watch your cartoons. Because I have participated in the movement all my life. The movement is my life, and I'm not leaving the movement till I have no more life. And it doesn't disrespect young people.
Now, I both have to tell you that you have to leave in a minute if you're going to make your 19-hour bus on time. But I also am mindful of the fact that I don't think you quite addressed the question about the Stay Away campaign. So you got 60 seconds.
Okay. One part of the Million Man March of 1995 was a stay-at-home campaign proposed by Reverend James Bevel, who used to be with Martin Luther King and FCLC, but he was working with Farrakhan, the Nation of Islam. And it came about for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons was the criticism that women and youth had no role or marginal roles in the Million Man March. So, and that a lot of men were not financially or otherwise able to come to DC. So the discussion was to put together a stay-at-home campaign, which unfortunately is the most passive form of a general strike. So some of us, we still had problems with it. But if you look at the polls, it will suggest that more people participated in the stay-at-home campaign, men, women, and children, than participated in the march. If you add the figures also, the Denver public school system shut the school system down, which meant Hispanic children did not go to school because they were afraid of possible conflicts in the school system. So the stay-at-home doesn't count them. Marion Barry, and there would have been no Million Man March without Marion Barry closing the city of Washington, D.C. down. And Clinton, I believe it was, gave the federal workers early leave and paid, you know, right. Them white federal workers from Northern Virginia did not come into D.C. I'm talking about thousands of them, tens of thousands of them. So the real impact of the march, directly, indirectly, has not been even talked about. No criticism, but the Nation of Islam does not even speak about the stay-at-home campaign. And one of the reasons is because some of the businessmen in the Nation of Islam don't believe in strikes. And we had that discussion in 1995. Does that help clarify? But no one can deny, and the records are there. The records are there to document it. Nobody has even written a serious report on it. And those who have ain't even mentioned the stay-at-home campaign. Those who criticize it because it was focused on men, because it wasn't left, because it wasn't this and other, they never talked about the stay-at-home campaign, which was mostly organized by women who stayed at home, and that's just boycott talk, but they also kept their children home. And nobody has analyzed how many came to the 10th and 20th anniversary who didn't go to the first one, who weren't even born. So there's been no serious analysis, historical or sociological, on that phenomenon. And that might be because of racism and ideological preferences. You white shit out of history you don't agree with.
Bob, we're going to give you a round of applause and let you get to your taxi. As we're saying goodbye to Bob, we have a couple of minutes for any closing questions or comments. First, I'll ask from the so-called audience, because I'm not sure if I really believe in that dichotomy. And then I'll ask Nejma, and Ian, and Johanna for some closing thoughts and remarks. But first, I'll give Bob a hug. All right, so do we have any further comments or questions? All right, so then Nejma, Ian, and Johanna, some last thoughts.
Okay, so just bouncing off everything that I've listened to tonight, especially this sister right here, and the talk about like intergenerational gaps and stuff. I think it is important to bridge those gaps. I think it's important to learn from people that have been organizing for a long time. And personally speaking, I've definitely engaged with, I'll just be blunt, like OG Panthers and stuff. And, I've realized like how much like a lot of the organizations and things have been like so traumatized by the government and COINTELPRO and everything that was talked about tonight. And I think, a lot of people, including myself for a long time, do think like, hey, I'm not really trying to organize with people. I don't trust people. Like, I think the government has really instilled a lot of fear and just has like torn apart and destroyed a lot of the past movements. But I think like it's important to recognize that they're still here. Like it's important to recognize that there's so many indigenous people all around the world internationally who are oppressed and fighting and throwing up panther flags and things that were talked about like in Brazil and stuff like that. We're not alone here. So I do really just agree with the fact that like we need to bring communities together and villages and tribes and like learn how to create for ourselves. And if we don't know how to do it, maybe the next person next to us does, and we can like build as communities and societies, because it does take a village, and it does take a village not only to raise a child, but like, to bring about a revolution. And it's more of a conscious thing, I think, in this modern day, because people just really need to understand that like we need each other, and if we interconnect and do that enough, that it will make a difference. It might seem like, it's so small and everything, but like if we keep doing that, then we can become like, our own villages and communities and connect with each other and support each other and uplift each other and change the fact that, you know, so many people are like oppressed in this world. So that's like pretty much what yeah.
Yeah, so closing thoughts. Thank you all again for being here. Thank you for everybody who will be watching this for years to come, hopefully. Yeah, bouncing off what Bob Brown left with, you know, his, you always get this, or at least I always get this in every panel that I've been on in Salt Lake, where there's, especially after Trump was elected, people who, you know, get brought into organizing from more liberal circles like the Democratic Party, who become disenfranchised with that, and they come in and they always ask this thing. It's like, hey, how can we join the struggle without stepping on people's toes, without X, Y, Z? And I think when, you know, Bob's comment about how much he works and the fact that, you know, that like struggle isn't a hobby, it's a mode of survival. It's what you do to survive. And so if you want to know what the requirements for, you know, being in the struggle, it's like these, it's like two and a half things, right? It's that you're honest and you're willing to work hard and you're down with the revolution. And there is nobody that personifies these things like Bob Brown and like other people his age, older, younger. And so like this idea that, you know, step aside or do this sort of thing. No, if you're down with the revolution, if you're willing to work hard and if you're honest, get in the front of the line, because there is not enough people like that in the world today, and we need more people like that in the world today.
Thank you. Great.
So I guess the theme of generational differences is a popular topic today. I think that people with decades of experience carry the history of victories and failures of the past. I mean, I gave a talk with an analysis of war and how war affects the domestic sphere and how it strengthens the state. But Leslie told us concretely, in very basic language, that the anti-war movement could not have happened without the decades of local organizing that came before. And it didn't happen overnight. And then Bob told us that 1967 was a turning point and why it was a turning point. So I think that movements, even the 60s movements, was an intergenerational movement. It wasn't only young people. I mean, Martin Luther King is the example. Martin Luther King was not 18 in he was a 30-some-odd-year-old man, right? And he was an integral part of that struggle. So movements have always been intergenerational, and people who are older with movement experience are critical to helping develop strategy and to passing the torch to a younger generation, not just the torch, but the legacy and history of the left lives through the people who are long-distance revolutionaries. I think that within movements, there are lots of egos. But that's something that we see among young people and older people. That's just part of, the conflict of living in a self-involved, individualistic, capitalist society. And one of the problems I see is that there are some people with an enormous amount of experience who feel threatened when younger people come around, and some folks don't want to share leadership. But I think that people like Bob, who have an opinion but are humanistic and humble, abound in the left. The last thing I'm going to say is that building communities and organizations of people of conscience is critical. We have a long distance project ahead of us of transforming the world. And we need to pass these ideas to a different generation. We might not get there ourselves, but another generation will, and we need to preserve and maintain alive this idea of resistance and dreaming of a different world. And we can't do that as individuals. As individuals, we become demoralized and we drop out of politics. It's only in collective settings and through organizations that we can better analyze the world and identify a way forward, but also, most importantly, preserve the tradition of the left in a society that seeks to atomize people. So it's our responsibility to attach ourselves to collectives in order to transmit this tradition beyond our generation.
And I guess I just want to end by saying a couple of quick things. It seems to me, and it's an irony when you look at that 60s mythology, that long 60s from 54 to 75, that some of the most well-known leaders of that period, especially the ones that emerged 52, 50, 48 years ago, the ones that emerged at the center of that storm, are the ones that in many cases have had historically the least to share and the least to give, because they weren't in the middle of the struggle when it was so difficult to organize. All they experienced was the mass. So when I think about the elders, and certainly some of the elders that Bob and Leslie and then later I learned from, some of the elders within the Musty circles, it wasn't Musty himself. He was actually told to, he was told to step aside. He said no, and he was loved. But he was one of those elders who knew that he had to have younger lieutenants, he called them, interesting for a pacifist, but he had to have younger folks. So people like Bayard Rustin or Bill Sutherland or Dave Dellinger or Barbara Deming, all of whom had this idea about revolutionary nonviolence and about making connections to new generations and new people across all kinds of race, class, gender lines. That was part of the basics of what it meant to organize. So when Dave Dellinger schooled Leslie and myself and others, he was one of those elders who was clear that while he was going to stay in it, he was also going to pass the baton on. And Leslie talked about a lot of lessons learned, and I think one thing that I wanted to add to that list was we have to learn from our mistakes. It's also through the mistakes, through taking action, messing up, and trying again. Because we're not going to be right all the time, and we're going to be criticized. So I want to, I guess, end by saying just a couple of things from the flyer, because it was sort of the official words that we decided we put out. When Bob and I talked, by the way, Bob mentioned this book that Cornel West wrote a foreword to, We Have Not Been Moved. And Bob has a chapter in that book which charts the history of the All African People's Revolutionary Party, GC, in a way that I think is profound and hard to find. But when Bob and I were talking about 8 months ago about this forum, we were doing it because he said, I'm traveling through Europe going to these no to NATO meetings. And there's all this big no to NATO stuff going on. And I'm talking to all of these War Resisters International types, your people. Tell me who's good and who I should hang out with and who I should talk to. And so we came up with this list of demands that we put on the flyer that I'll just state here again because we haven't stated them. We will not fight in unjust wars in any corner of the world. No to the military-industrial complex worldwide. No to NATO and UN peacekeeping forces. No to US AFRICOM, US CENTCOM, US EUCOM, US NORTHCOM, US PACCOM, and US SOUTHCOM. US out of Guantanamo, Cuba, US out of the Shannon Airport in Ireland, and resist war taxes. 50 years later, in 2017, the All-African People's Revolutionary Party, GC, the A.J. Muste Memorial Institute, our friends and our allies, refresh and renew this call. Hell no, we still ain't going. Thank you.